In these talks, it seems that two models of the self are being held in contrast. The Jungian self, which must be realized or somehow reconciled within the individual, and the Buddhist, which must be overcome, and from which one must be freed. If you could please discuss these models and or any convergence or divergence between them, and I guess between your views are all clearly unique, maybe not pigeonholed within those views, but how would you address that question?
One of the insights that's attributed to Jung was the idea of the self-organizing psyche. I believe it's Stora does that in one of his books. And I think perhaps if we centered on understanding it that way, I'm not a Jungian scholar, so this is me reaching across the table, I guess, then we might be able to integrate it with the Buddhist notion along the following way. Perhaps one way of reconceiving what the Buddhists say is not so much that there's no self, but there's no self beyond self-organization. That all there is to the self is self-organization. And then if you reconceptualized what the Buddhists are saying along those lines, and many who are in the convergence between Buddhism and cognitive science talk that way, then I see once you make that move, then it would be possible, I think, I'm like I say, maybe Jordan can comment on it, that there would be a way of reconciling it with the Jungian notion of the psyche being fundamentally self-organizing in nature, and perhaps seeing the self just as the virtual engine governing this self-organizing process rather than sort of some intelligent designer behind it all or something like that.
Right.
Okay. So that's my attempt to start to narrow it and create a linking vocabulary at least.
Tony, I hear you breathing.
Do you want to say something? I can say something to this.
No, go ahead.
Okay. We actually addressed this question in my last class on Wednesday. So those of you who are from my new 232 class, we did talk about the Jungian and the Buddhist nature of self and where they come together. And what I said in that class, and I don't know if this is the right answer, but the notion of no self in Buddhism implies a kind of self that is not fixed along purely conditioning processes that distort perception and cognition and so on. The absence of inherent nature of self. Not that there's no personality or no tendencies, but that these selves are not fixed or existing beyond the actual experience. The Jungian idea of individuation, which is his concept that approaches no self, the way he describes it is that it is instead of the fact, in his model of typology, sensing, intuiting, feeling, and thinking, extroversion, introversion, 2x4, kind of the Myers-Briggs way of assessing yourself, people usually fall in some way on those polarities. Some people are thinkers and feelers and sensors and intuitors, extroverted, introverted. But in an individuated person, one doesn't fall into any category. In other words, one responds to a context based on what the context requires of you, not fixed with a conditioning history. So in other words, you're more responsive, more wise in your reactions based on a more fluid expression of personality. Mm-hmm. And that closely resembles the Buddhist notion of no self. And Jung said to reach that approach, the Eightfold Path would be the way to do it. So.
If I could just ask one follow-up, I know that also you often work within the Freudian field. Like, how would you work the superego into that kind of correlation?
That's the hard
if at all.
One. See, now you ruined it.
If at all.
See?
I can do that.
Okay. Perfect segue.
We'll let Jordan go to that
so,
one.
One of the things that seemed to emerge today was my realization that there was a split between Freudian and Jungian Buddhisms. And the Freudian Buddhism says your desires should be inhibited. They're dangerous. And the Jungian Buddhism says, no, they should be transmuted. And it was the transmutation approach that John took in his lecture, and I thought he did that. I thought he did that brilliantly. And so I would say, well, the transmutation approach is right, just like Jung is right and Freud isn't. But the thing is, well, no, but hang on a sec. Freud is right about a lot of things, and there's always the issue of stage. So I would say, if you can't inhibit, there's no way you'll transmute. So if you're so bloody chaotic that you've got no capacity to inhibit, you've got no superego, it's sort of like the adult development issue you were talking about. Nietzsche talked about this. He said slavery was a necessary precondition to freedom. And so the idea is you have to undergo a process that enables you to repress and inhibit and to control before you get anywhere near something that resembles transmutation, because if you haven't got the inhibition down, and we know when this has to occur, it has to occur sometime between the ages of 2 and 4, you'll be so intolerable a hypothalamic narcissist that children your own age won't play with you, and you'll cease to develop at that point, and nothing can be done to fix that. So for some people, it's like, yeah, a little inhibition, man, it'd be a good thing. And this is, you also see this reflected in the structure of the Old and New Testaments, because in the Old Testament, morality is thou shalt not. And if you're fundamentally corrupt, thou shalt not, that's a good start. And then maybe once you've got yourself organized under a fairly heavy load of thou shalt nots, then you can start thinking about what might go beyond that, and that's exactly what happens in the Sermon on the Mount. So there's a Freudian and a Jungian Old and New Testament approach as well. So anyways, that's
good. And I'd like to add one more piece of that.
Sure.
In the Freudian superego, consists of many aspects. There's a conscience. There's the sadistic superego, the one that tells us that we've done wrong, we're bad, and so on. But there's a part of the superego, the early part of the superego, called the ego ideal. The ego ideal is that part of you that tries to be the best you can be.
Right.
We all have an ego ideal, usually, often, as my class has heard, absorbed from our family, our parents, our caregivers, our society. Often it's to be a good person, to be a member of society, to achieve something in a career. It can be, and it can be even more major. It can become, I want to cure cancer, I want to save the world, I want to change the world. It can become a very big ego ideal, bigger and bigger and bigger. And to that degree, some ego ideals are things like, I want to be a Buddha. I want to achieve Shiva nature. I want to achieve Krishna consciousness. These are all highly extreme, large ego ideals. Freud doesn't talk too much about that, but it's within that. And in that sense, that accomplishes it's very similar to the Buddhist ideal of the Bodhisattva. So Jesus would be, to become like Jesus would be like an ego ideal, or to become like any saint. And so becoming like a Buddha would be, a Bodhisattva would be an equivalent motivation. And that's in the superego.
Yeah, and I think clearly these ideas like the self and the ego ideal and religious icons are definitely kind of semantically treading over similar territory, if not identical, especially from the standpoint of an unenlightened individual.